Hi, and welcome to the Property Development Derisked podcast, where we talk all things pre-construction, basically everything before a spade hits the ground. We get the experts in to help you keep your projects on track. So, in today's episode, we will cover all things MMC. What is it? Why is it important? And how to keep your projects on track and de-risk through development. In today's episode, we've got Trina Chakrvarti, Project Director at Building Better. Welcome, Trina. Nice to have you on board.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, excellent. And just to let the audience know, so Trina's been working in the housing space for over 10 years, and majority of your time was at the National Housing Federation. And then you and your team came up with this new innovation around MMC to build what is now Building Better, which now you're project director and it's its own company in its own right. So that's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have been in housing for 10 years, but actually that experience was not related to construction and it wasn't related to development. And really it wasn't related to housing specifically. It was, I was in a marketing role and my background has been marketing, communications and product development. But I think in a sense that meant when I came to Building Better and the idea for it, it meant I was able to bring in maybe a slightly different perspective from people who'd worked in the industry for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think I would say that kind of view from a little bit from the outside to shake things up slightly is super valuable, especially when you're innovating in the housing sector and public sector housing. So yeah, I think that's extremely valuable. Just tell us a little bit about that story. So you were previously working in marketing for National Housing Federation, which is the body for all housing associations across England. How did you get from that to Building Better? Just kind of explain that journey for the audience.
With a lot of luck, I guess. The National Housing Federation ran an innovation program in 2018, which is called the Greenhouse. And I applied for a position. I was put in a group with 4 other individuals from other housing associations across the country. We were given kind of a problem statement. And the problem was, how do we increase the supply of high quality homes? And so we went through quite a rigorous process. We interviewed over 100 people, read so many reports, and these same trends keep coming up over and over again. Really, that the problem we had with new builds was, of course, we have a problem with supply and the numbers, but a real crisis with quality, and a number of reasons why quality of new build tends to be so poor, related to the skills, related to processes, related to design, lack of ownership in the development process, but for a whole host of reasons, quality seemed to be the biggest issue. And so come 2019, we thought we had a good idea. We pitched it to a couple of housing associations, who thought it was a good idea and thought we should try and make it a thing in its own right.
What was the idea at that point in time?
Yeah, as I was saying that, I thought I should probably explain what exactly the idea is. So the idea is collaboration. So bringing together housing associations and local authorities to build really high quality and sustainable homes using modern method construction. And I'd say here as well, Gonzalo, the idea in itself is not so innovative. Like modern method construction, we might talk about this a bit later, aren't all that modern, and housing associations using modern method construction or MMC is not all that modern, but doing it together, genuinely encouraging collaboration between housing associations and manufacturers and with their customers, that is a novel approach. And I think in the past, it's always seemed a bit soft, and that's where an external perspective can sometimes be very helpful, because it adds that sort of that commercial value of doing collaboration well. That really has been a driving force for Building Better since 2018, since that project started.
Yeah, and essentially it's having that joint learning, so that housing associations aren't learning about MMC individually and then another person will repeat that mistake again. It's sharing those across the board, and also trying to get, is it also about getting better buying economics from the manufacturers as well?
It absolutely is. So you're 100% correct. It is about sharing in the risks and the rewards, not making the same mistakes over and over again, although there is still a little bit of that happening in our sector. Understandably, we are a diverse sector with lots of different organizations of lots of different sizes, all over the country. But also, you're right, aggregating demand. So pulling together pipelines, which means we're in a stronger negotiating power, which means we are actually sitting across the table from manufacturers who can see that long-term visible pipeline, and get costs to where they need to be to make modern method construction or offsite manufacturing viable compared with traditional construction.
Yeah, excellent. Well, what a journey! And then it was part of that. Building Better was part of the National Housing Federation, right? And then recently it's separated into its own entity. So you've become kind of entrepreneur / business owner, kind of overnight, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't really see myself that way, and it's also just a bit awkward. But you're right, yeah. So
Yeah.
Building Better has become its own company, limited by guarantee. The idea is that any income we are able to generate goes back into the business for R&D, because this is about housing associations and local authorities having that agency in the development process, and that also means staying ahead of the technology curve. So we want to be able to put any income back into the business, which is the reason why we've also incorporated as a community interest company. And I think for us, it was important to kind of set our stake in the ground and say we're about that community, which is in our case social housing and social housing customers.
Yeah, amazing. Cool, excellent. Well, talking about MMC, to kind of share the knowledge. Obviously, you've been having these discussions for a very long time and learning a lot about it. Just to share with kind of our viewers, what is MMC? How would you kind of explain it, high level?
So I will start by saying MMC, or modern method construction, I did say before, are not all that modern. And the reason is they've been around since World War II. Another word commonly used for MMC or offsite is prefab or prefabricated buildings. And it's essentially where any element of the house or the whole house is built off-site and in a factory. That might include the whole kind of 3D box, if you like, and that's one end of the MMC scale. So like almost like a fully finished Tetris box that's just plonked on top of each other. That's called modular or volumetric or category 1. And then another very common form of MMC is your panelized or flat pack. It's almost like an IKEA flat pack style house, which comes in on the back of a lorry and then it gets assembled on site into a 3D building. And then you've got lots of other categories, all the way up to 7 as well, which include 3D printing, which is less commonly used in the UK, but is definitely starting to be used more widely in the Far East of Asia and in Europe. There are sort of elements of the house built in modular or volumetric, like a bathroom pod or a kitchen pod. And there are also sorts of digital technologies as well, like BIM and ways to make labor more productive. So yeah, it's a catch-all for a really big host of things, but Building Better is focused primarily on those first two, so that volumetric and that panelized. And one thing we found out really recently, so the National Housing Federation launched a survey, I think the first one of the sector. Housing associations either started or completed 15,000 category 1 and category 2 homes, on site last year. Now that is much higher than we thought, and it is still a nascent industry, but there's clearly demand as well as capacity there. I feel I've kind of gone off the thread, Gonzalo, of where we
No, that's
started
excellent.
with what MMC is.
I think that was a really good overview, and I think it's important mentioning MMC, that there is kind of a guide in the categories of MMC, which people can Google it, the MMC categories, and you'll find them online. But essentially, exactly what you said, it goes all the way from 1 to 7, and the most kind of, I would say, ready to go ones are basically 1, 2, 1 is, as you said, just the box is ready, all the plumbing, all the fittings, everything's finished.
All in there.
It on the site, and then the next one, and it goes down and down. But yeah, I think that for others to have a better understanding of it, I highly recommend you go and look at the categories and understand it. But yeah, so the focus of Building Better is in number 1 and number 2, and you've now got a framework with vetted kind of manufacturers that have got onto your DPS, your direct procurement system, dynamic procurement system, and these are specifically category 1 and category 2. Is that right?
Yeah, we've developed two procurement routes, which are a little bit different, actually. And I just want to quickly say as well, we are thinking about the other categories because although sometimes it's easier to see where the benefit will happen by standardizing on the component level or on the software level. Actually, huge advantages might be gained in terms of efficiencies for housing associations and local authorities. But like you say, we kind of focus on that category one or that modular or volumetric and that category two or panelized to begin with. And actually, one of the first lessons we learned was we can't apply the same procurement route to both. Should I just quickly say what a procurement route is as well? Because I sometimes feel like we just kind of assume that people know what a procurement route is. Really,
please.
really all a procurement route is a way to buy, like almost like a contractual agreement to be able to buy something from somebody else. So if you're the housing association and I'm the manufacturer, you will need a procurement route because you're buying things that are really expensive and that rightly so, there should be some rules and regulations around how you find the manufacturer or the supplier who's going to sell to you. So the procurement route is just a kind of contractual agreement that allows a customer to buy from a supplier. And yeah, like I say, one of the first lessons was we couldn't just pick up the procurement route we developed for the category one and modular providers and apply it to category two. Actually, we needed to do something quite different.
Yeah, and just to clarify as well, is your customers are all housing associations and local authorities that are part of the Building Better Alliance that buy these services. So yeah, the procurement route is extremely important because there's lots of rules for public sector buying for obvious reasons. So yeah, excellent. And a question I've got for you, which I think really fits into to kind of what we're doing and this kind of podcast as well, is how does MMC specifically help to de-risk a development?
So in a few different ways. First of all, MMC or modern method of construction, another phrase commonly used is precision engineering. And the reason that's used is the whole idea behind modern method of construction is that you are using digital tools, you're using automation where possible, and in a controlled factory setting, with people who are trained to do that particular job. And the cumulative effect of all of that is a really high quality product. So one of the ways you're de-risking a site is by being confident that the unit or the panels that come to your site already have that quality assurance baked into the product. Most of the manufacturers that you can buy homes from or panels from, and certainly all of the manufacturers that Building Better gives access to, are certified by all of the usual warranty providers or assurance providers. And all that means is that some very clever technical people have gone in and said, yes, tick, you meet the criteria for being a safe quality product. So that's one thing, kind of quality. You can be assured about that. Although there are some nuances and difficulties about when it actually comes to site and gets installed on site. But that's one way I think it's de-risked. The other is for many manufacturers, they know what it costs to build something above ground. That element of fixed costs is pretty novel for our sector. In general, what tends to happen is you sort of get into contract on the basis of a kind of rough sum, and then those costs might change. In fact, in the current environment, some contractors are fixing costs for 2 weeks, where our manufacturers are fixing them for a year. So, and the reason they're able to do that is because they buy in bulk and they buy early. The whole point about MMC working is that it can only work with volume at scale. And so that's another way it's de-risk, kind of being confident about your price. Those are fixed. And really manufacturers have a very good idea of what things cost above ground. Again, a little nuance there. The complexity there is maybe they're not always so good at knowing how to cost things below ground, but they're certainly getting better at that.
Excellent. One other one I wanted to ask you about is the time as well, especially in an environment like now where the economy, things are moving all the time. The pound is going low. All of a sudden it's rising. All costs are rising as well. And everything's moving in lots of different directions. Our house price is going to go down 10% next year. I don't know. All this sort of stuff. You need to, if you're looking to build a scheme, you want to be able to do it as fast as possible, borrow for the least amount of time, and know what market you're going to be in when you sell. So timing, would you also say that's kind of a key winner against the traditional methods?
Absolutely. I mean, so in theory, you can build a home in a factory in about 10 days in some cases. I mean, it drastically shortens the amount of time it would take to build on site using kind of traditional bricks and cement. However, and I'm going to put another caveat in here, the industry is still nascent. And even though these properties can be built, these homes can be built really quickly inside a factory, it's still quite tricky to find the people who are going to work and do the development or the foundations below ground. So there's an area there that's kind of holding things up. And really, in the whole development process, the actual building of the home is quite a short bit of it. You've got this whole section before around planning, around kind of finding the land, and then doing the groundworks. And really, a lot of the delays in development are there. So yes, MMC is absolutely a good reason to do it, is to kind of speed up the process and generate income more quickly as well, because obviously you get rents in more quickly if people move in faster. But there are some caveats to that, just because of the nature of development, and also because it's tricky to get people to work on the ground as well at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. That is a challenge getting people in, and we're seeing that from lots of our customers. But some really interesting things you touched on, and kind of the mention of above ground to below ground, and kind of having that split, and that's kind of a commonly well-known split with kind of MMC. It's that this provider that you're kind of buying something off the shelf, in a sense, that you can either plop on site or you install on site, is everything above ground. So the foundations need to get done to a certain degree, and then someone comes and the MMC provider, either themselves or someone else, will actually install them. But that's really interesting differentiation between below ground risk and above ground risk. If you can mitigate the above ground risk, which are also very large on all developments, then that's a massive win for the developer and the client, because at least they know once we get above ground, once we get to the finish the foundations and we're ready to go, then it's relatively risk-free. We've signed up to a fixed price contract. We know the scope. We know the kind of requirements of what's going to be included in the fit out. And that below ground risk is quite interesting, because that's where we specialize, which is we want to help clients to de-risk their sites, which is all about what's actually on the site. But as soon as you've done that and you've de-risked it, then MMC is a great route to be able to minimize variations in the future and increase in prices. So yeah, it's an interesting differentiation between the below ground and above ground risks.
That's really true. And if I can add something that we're seeing in terms of trends in the marketplace, we're certainly seeing that some manufacturers, particularly the ones who are doing the whole box, so the category 1 manufacturers, they are increasingly doing turnkey services. All turnkey means is that the manufacturer acts as the principal contractor, which means they hold ownership of the entire project, including getting into contract with the subcontractors who are going to work on the ground, including actually manufacturing it, and then also the installation. So they're they're holding the whole risk for this particular site. And we're certainly seeing a trend in many of those providers trying to bring construction services in-house, because actually it's really quite tricky when you are just building the property to then have strong enough relationships with the people who are working on the site to deliver something that is as high quality, as efficient as it could be if you had those skills in-house. So one of the trends we're seeing is that many of those category 1 providers are starting to bring those construction skills in-house, and then trying to blend those construction and manufacturing teams so that they have a really good an efficient way of working together. The other trend we're seeing is a more regional focus. So for many providers, and this is certainly true of your category 2 or those panelized providers, is where they are happy to do turnkey or act as principal contractor or do everything on the site, they only want to do it within a very small geography, because one of the ways they're increasing risk to their businesses is by going really far out from where they've got their supply chains and where they know their ground workers, and actually they'd much rather kind of stay in a limited geography. So that's another trend we're seeing, is that kind of focus on regional supply chains and regional relationships. And that's true of the customers as well as, in this case, the housing associations and local authorities.
Yeah, excellent. And something, I don't know what your experience of this, but something that I've seen as well is following kind of the evolution of MMC in the UK. Some of these early manufacturers that came in and are doing really well, which is exciting. You've seen them before. You could tell that their business model was a kind of off the shelves. You come to us, you buy this and take it and install it yourself. Now they're starting to realize they need to get a little bit more involved. So they're doing turnkey, as you're mentioning, which kind of managing the project to make sure it gets delivered well. But I'm seeing some of them go even further, because one of the key concerns with MMC is there's a bottleneck of a lack of kind of sites and opportunities. And if you have a big factory, you need to have a huge pipeline of sites of projects going forward. So what I've been seeing, and I'm sure you have as well, is a lot of these providers are starting to become developers, and they're buying land.
100%.
Because they need to feed themselves, basically, until the market gets confident enough to start being able to push so much to them that they can start sitting back and maybe just doing turnkey or maybe just doing off the shelf. But you're seeing them go further and further into the development side.
You're absolutely right. And all of this change is happening in quite a short span of time. Like, some of those providers you're talking about have only been around 5 years, 4 years. So they're startups themselves and learning as they go and kind of pivoting as they go. So you're absolutely right. That sort of taking on that developer role is quite a recent trend for some of these manufacturers. Don't get me wrong. Some of the other manufacturers have been around for decades, like some of the kind of timber frame, those category 2 providers. But some of the ones that have got a very good reputation we're talking about, or taking on more of that developer role, you're right, haven't been doing it very long, and are adapting as they go, because there's clearly a gap in the market. And that gap comes down to housing associations rightly being quite risk averse businesses. They are worried about where they spend their money, making sure that it's good value for money, and then also being able to feel confident that that quality means that they won't be paying shed loads of money down the line to kind of repair and maintain them. So yeah, that risk averseness, which is, I think, rightly there, is one of the reasons those gaps exist.
And then, so talking about Building Better, if you could give us kind of an overview of what essentially Building Better, what it is. We touched on it slightly previously, but what I'd like is if you could give a quick overview of kind of what it's about, and also how local authorities and housing associations can use you and partner with Building Better in order to get projects over the line using MMC.
Yeah, of course. So Building Better has done a few things over the past few years. First of all, sort of just standardize things. So we agreed as a group what is our high level baseline specification based on kind of focusing on performance alone. So things like agreeing that as a group we only want to work with manufacturers that can build homes that can be delivered to net zero carbon and operation standards, that have superior fire safety mechanisms in there, that are fabric first. In addition to that, we've kind of pulled this pipeline together. We've had 1,500 units put through our framework and our dynamic purchasing system, those 2 procurement routes we talked about earlier. Of those, 451 is latest count, are looking really good, looking really sound, and we're waiting on planning decisions on those before we can get into contract. And then a lot of the other stuff we've done is just trying to make it easier for our housing association local authority members. So, for example, having a template pre-construction services agreement, having a scopes of service for employers agents, having a checklist for clerks of works, because actually when a clerk of works goes into a factory and then on site, it's quite different from just going to the one place. They've now got 2 sites they need to visit, and because the process is so different as well. So that kind of developing these tools that make the whole thing a little bit easier rather than trying to go alone. And the way housing association and local authority can join is really easy. Just you basically become part of this group, and that gives you access to the 2 procurement routes as well as the kind of broader network. Because really the thing that is the hardest to kind of make the case for is the value of the network, like housing associations and local authorities just being able to share with each other where a scheme has gone horribly wrong or where they incurred some massive cost they didn't anticipate seeing. That kind of thing is really difficult to put a price on, but can be very, very helpful when trying to do something that's new for the business.
Yeah, the potential abortive costs that we see in the industry, but no one really likes to talk about that much. On all our episodes, we always talk about abortive costs, and I've seen them in the industry before. There's money's been spent on certain items which could have been mitigated earlier if things were done in a different way. And I feel like we never really, because no one likes to talk about them, there's never kind of a lessons learned, and it kind of repeats on a rolling basis. And I would love to one day do some sort of report and calculation to find out how much we anticipate is being spent on a yearly basis on abortive costs in the industry.
I mean, that's a bit scary, the idea that we'll have that number to reflect on, but probably a really, really important one. So we recently actually had a situation of a housing association putting forward a scheme onto the dynamic purchasing system. And all that means is that the particular scheme was up for tender. So manufacturers could essentially put in a bid to explain what the cost would be, what the design would be, and it was a competitive process. The scheme was for 38 units in the Midlands. And as soon as it kind of went into the process, the manufacturers that were interested were able to, in a really compliant way, have conversations with this particular housing association member. And the other thing that's really quite useful about what happened was the housing association was able to be really upfront about the scheme budget they were working to, which is a big cultural change from traditional construction, where you're always hiding the number because you're scared that the contractor will essentially make the numbers work up to that number rather than just telling you upfront what the cost is going to be. It turns out the scheme was not viable for a number of reasons. It just didn't stack up because the ground needed to be leveled, which put a massive price tag on it, and there were some other issues with the funding. But the only reason this was found out was because one of the manufacturers proactively, having seen the logo for the architect on one of the drawings, contacted them, found out about what would have been the costs underground, and were able to give a proper reflective cost, which essentially made the whole scheme unviable. And the reason I mention this case study is because even though it was a failed example, in a sense, it's a scheme that didn't go through, it's a great example of how manufacturers and housing associations working collaboratively and honestly and kind of in the spirit of sort of trying to make things work together in a transparent way, were able to avoid massive costs down the line had they gone into contract and then all the stuff had come up later down the line. So yeah, hopefully an odd but hopefully a useful example of abortive costs being or very high abortive costs being avoided down the line.
Yeah, amazing. And how much was the cost for kind of leveling the ground?
It was about £1.5 million,
yeah,
and an additional £1 million.
So a lot of money on 38 units.
Exactly.
And yeah, I love that example. And one of the reasons is because the early involvement that is kind of a key part of using modern methods of construction and getting these manufacturers in early on the scheme meant that was found out way earlier than it would have been otherwise. So what would have typically happened otherwise if you were doing traditional construction is the team would have decided to do the feasibility assessment. It would have looked good. So potentially they would have missed that item. It would have progressed to RIBA, so RIBA, Royal Institution of British Architects, stage 2 for more designs. Then they would have said, yeah, let's proceed. RIBA stage 3, so it gets further developed. Then a contractor might actually come on board at that stage, potentially got into contract, and only then would you realise the contractor would say, oh, by the way, you need to level all this ground and it's going to cost £1 million. But you've already spent so much that it'd be really hard to either pull out the scheme. And if they did pull out the scheme, they would have spent tens or even hundreds of thousands on the design team.
Getting to that point. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah. painful. But yeah, one question I wanted to ask you as well, Trina, is I know you did some research, and I remember regarding the cost comparables, which people always are quite interested in, about the cost comparables between using modern methods of construction against the traditional approach, which is traditional build, and what you're seeing in the market in terms of how the costs currently compare.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it comes to, I think, one of two big challenges we're definitely seeing in trying to make MMC work practically. The first is, as you say, this cost comparison. And the feedback we're getting is that it's quite hard to compare the costs for a scheme designed using modern method construction compared with traditional, because there are elements of an MMC build that are sometimes forgotten about when you're comparing. So as an example, you don't need as many skips when you're building using MMC because you don't have as much waste. You don't need the scaffolding up as long because it's a quicker build. So there are all these assumptions that are made by a cost consultant or a housing association building up the cost for an MMC scheme versus traditional, which make it seem unviable, but actually with a little bit of interrogation, you'd see that those costs do stack up really well. And part of that is due to the fact that it's just maybe, inexperience. We've not been doing this very long, but also within housing associations as well, there's sometimes a little bit of reticence to interrogate your cost consultant because they kind of usually have this expertise, and also resource. You're already stretched for time, you're working on multiple schemes. It can feel really hard to put that additional effort in. So that is one thing we're seeing. And also on the flip side of that, we are, to try and counter some of that, like you say, doing some case studies for members who are going through this process. It seems that building using category 1 and 2 is viable compared with traditional, basically in most of the country, all over England, except the northeast seems it's quite tricky still to make the numbers stack up. But for much of the rest of the country, it is stacking up really quite well, particularly because for many of our members, building using MMC is a means to build really sustainable and energy well-performing homes. And if you're going to build to that higher spec anyway, it's much easier to do that at a smaller uplift on MMC than it is doing traditional. If I could also mention the other big challenge that we're seeing, Gonzalo, on a practical level, it is the type of schemes that organizations are putting forward. Again, understandably, many housing associations and local authorities have these sort of garage sites, or of maybe 8 or 9 or 10, and they want to develop those homes using modern method construction. But the big problem here is that they're finding a site that was already difficult to do without the numbers that mean from a manufacturer perspective that volume brings the cost down, and then trying to make it stack up. So you've picked an already difficult site with small numbers that might be hard to access, and then trying to get a cost comparable situation. So that's one issue that is understandable, and I think is an element of the sector developing. But as we go down the line, we're hoping that housing associations and local authorities, I feel like kind of cautiously optimistic, they will start to feel more confident and put bigger schemes forward.
Yeah, hopefully. And do you think it's kind of sometimes they have all these different sites, and then some of them where they're like, okay, nobody else wants that. Okay, let's try MMC. It's kind of like, if they see that there's a site that has a lot of interest from the private sector, they'll just procure it nice and easily and get it done traditionally. But if there's one that they're struggling to procure and nobody's really interested in, then all of a sudden that's the one that might be right for MMC.
Exactly.
Yeah. On kind of the cost comparisons you were saying as well, one point I wanted to kind of add to that is as well, because of the speed of doing building with modern methods of construction over traditional, especially now, there's something that needs to be included in the price, which I'm sure you and your team do, is the funding and the cost of borrowing money, because the client will be borrowing money hopefully for less time than with traditional, and as the interest rates are much higher than they used to be, that's more important than ever, because that's a very big difference in price. If your 2-year project is all of a sudden 9 months, it's very, very different, especially post-contract. So, yeah. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. One of the ways we're trying to enable kind of greater transparency around those things, as well as encouraging our members to use a pre-construction services agreement. And that's one of the things we have, which we're kind of sharing with members. But all it does is it gets everyone around the table very early doors to kind of agree how you share in the risks and rewards as the scheme progresses. Because as we know, it can take an achingly long time for development to happen on a particular scheme.
Yeah. And it's funny, we were talking about this slightly before this session, but just innovation in the sector is actually quite challenging sometimes. For example, yourselves, you built Building Better from scratch and brought it to the industry, and it takes a while, especially in the construction sector, in the housing sector, but also public sector housing, with working with local authorities and housing associations and giving them confidence that what you're doing can be delivered, because as you said before, they're very, very risk adverse. And that innovation and bringing those projects forward takes a very long time. We've experienced it as well as yourself, but I feel like, what do you think is the answer to that, to helping them to get more trust and bring projects forward faster?
There's a practical thing, which is first identifying the organizations that are more likely to be the early adopters. And in our experience, those organizations have tended to be the sort of medium-sized businesses rather than the really large or the really small ones. So they've sort of got enough resource to try stuff, but they're also ambitious, and they tend to have development directors or asset directors who have quite a lot of autonomy and agency and are quite ambitious and kind of charismatic themselves. So there's a sort of type of customer that fits that early adopter, and finding who those organizations are can be really important in an early stage of a business like ours. Yeah. The other thing I'd say is reducing risk, because yes, they are risk averse with good reason. And the way to reduce risk is to work with others. Why do it all on your own and make all of the same mistakes when you can share in the costs and in the learnings as you kind of make progress on something like MMC or whatever the other area of innovation might be. So yeah, I think finding the right partners and then doing it together.
Yeah, and that early adopter thing is really important as well. And I think one of your earliest adopters is also one of our earliest adopters, right? Raven Housing Trust. They were our first customer, and they were kind of pivotal in the early stages of Building Better as well, right?
Yes, Raven were the very first housing association that we pitched our idea to and that came on board. So yeah, there are organizations out there that kind of see the bigger picture and see the value of kind of attempting to try something differently. And they're certainly not the only one, although they are incredible and their development director is amazing. But there are other businesses out there, but finding them isn't always easy.
Awesome. Well, look, that was an absolutely fascinating session. So thank you so much, Trina, for your time and for sharing your journey, your insights, and everything you've learned about MMC. If anyone wants to kind of reach out and is interested in Building Better and would like to get involved, what's the best way to kind of get in contact with you?
However is easiest for them. We're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn. I've obviously got an email address, so just get in touch. What we usually do is help organizations initially just by putting them in touch with other organizations. So you don't have to be a member. We can just put you in touch with other housing associations and local authorities going through or at the same stage as you are. But yeah, just feel free to drop me a line. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Yeah, no problem. And I'll add your contact details in the comments so that they can get in touch a little bit easier. But yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for watching again, and see you next week.